Good evening, um, and welcome to QuorumCon 2021. My name is Daniel Kelly. I'm the author of The Fall of the Phoenix and the sequel, A Hero's Welcome. The Fall of the Phoenix is The Fall of the Phoenix is based on the last days of the fall of Troy, and A Hero's Welcome are the direct aftermath of the fall of Troy. So, yeah. Sorry, this is distracting. So it's A Hero's Welcome's basically what happens to the survivors from the War of Troy as they're trying to, the Greeks are trying to get home, and the survivors of Troy itself are struggling to find somewhere that they can survive and sort of avoid being tracked down by the Greeks after the battle when they're being hunted. So I have decided after my last reading to pick a chapter where the names aren't quite so Greek and difficult to pronounce. So I'm going to go for chapter 26 on A Hero's Welcome. After so long aboard ship, it was good to get out and stretch your legs, but Romulus could feel the stiffness of the long hike settling in, and they still had to travel back to the ships. Autumn may well have set in, but the afternoon sunshine was stifling over a long walk. He had been watching the hills grow closer over the last hour as he sweated. His legs had begun to burn almost immediately as the gradient increased. When they reached the base of the hill, it seemed to have doubled in size. Now it was taking all of his concentration just to place one foot in front of the other. He looked across at Remus and Aeneas, frustrated to see that they didn't seem to be experiencing any problems with the day's outing, but they had been keeping much more active than he had lately. Aeneas had numerous hunting outings with Dido while they had stayed in Carthage, and Remus had been using his free time on land doing drills with what was left of the maidens and had taken on training of young Diomedes. He seemed to be trying to replace Patroclus. The hill was steeper, rougher, and scrubbier than it had looked from a distance. Roots of trees caught in his feet, and rocks rolled away under his feet as he put weight on them. It was arable ground, but not like the land he had left behind, though perhaps it had not yet been settled and farmed enough. That seemed likely from the land they had passed on the way here, which had a low level of population and only small farmsteads. Aeneas was the first to crest the hill and stood there like a man enjoying an afternoon stroll, spear grounded and staring out beyond. That's more like it, he said. Romulus was still struggling up the rough scree of the slope, wondering what he was to be seen. Standing beside Aeneas, Remus lifted his water bag, pulled the stopper, and took a long drink and handed it to Aeneas. Romulus finally scrambled up beside him onto the broad top of the hill and stood with his hands on his knees, breathing hard, until the water bag was held under his face. Aeneas shook it to get his attention. You need to take better care of yourself. He straightened and took the bag, tilting his head back, pour a stream of sour, warm, brackish water down his throat. Nothing had ever tasted sweeter. He lowered the bag, wiping his mouth on the back of his arm before he answered. Someone had to take care of the administration side of things while you were away chasing pretty queens, and you played with your toy soldiers. Did you think the ships restocked themselves? They laughed, but Romulus had only been half joking. Then he looked at the view. Houses, a lot of houses, inside a large area enclosed by a wall. The hill they had just climbed gave him a direct view. From their vantage point, it suddenly became clear that they had entered a hilly area after the flat pastures they had passed since they had left the sea. Perhaps they were in the foothills of some distant mountain range, but all around them hills rolled and dipped into valleys. Who knew what was beyond that again? There was a hill about a mile from where they stood, maybe two, when you took in the size of the valleys between into account, where quite a sizable town had been built, a rough mixture of proper stone architecture interspersed with rougher wooden huts with thatched roof. 100 dwellings, maybe more. The hillside, it made it hard to judge. Smoke drifted lazily from a few roofs. Excitement welled inside him, which he pushed down with some difficulty. He was naturally cautious, and if this trip had taught him anything, it was that visitors were not always welcome. Some villages were so wild and savage, given the chance, he was sure they would eat anyone they captured. Dido had warned them about the outlying villages when they'd been in Carthage. Her exact words had been, they killed foreigners and children as ritual sacrifice to their gods, but I'm sure they eat them afterwards, was no bodies have ever turned up. Those were backwards mud-built villages, he reminded himself. The stone-built houses here, though they were few and difficult to make out in any detail at this distance, suggested these were more civilized people. The need to find somewhere to shelter over the winter weighed heavily on his shoulders. Handing the water skin back to Remus, he moved forward. He had barely taken 2 steps when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Is this wise? Asked Remus, unusually cautious, but Aeneas's face held a similar apprehension. Where are the villagers? He asked, looking at the town. In a settlement of that size, we should see some activity from here. Remus was nodding in agreement. Something is strange. City gates are open, but there's no traffic. I think we should be wary, brother. Romulus scolded himself for not noticing. The town looked abandoned except for the wisps of smoke rising from a few roofs. What choice do we have? He asked. The other two with a shrug. We could always return to the boats and maybe try a little further north, said Aeneas doubtfully. Romulus could understand their reluctance. Their arrival had not been particularly welcome so far, with the exception of Carthage, who had secretly been planning to enslave them to power their ships. Look, we've been searching for people, for a village where we might be accepted and could possibly settle. How are we going to do that if we avoid every town? He looked from one to the other. What makes you think any farther north will be any better? Look at this land, Remus. It's like home. We know how to work with land like this. Fair enough, Remus exchanged a look with Aeneas. But it's a long run back to the boats if we're wrong. They both chuckled. Romulus was laughing too. Then pray to Taichi that he is in a favourable mood. The hand was still on Romulus's shoulder, but he moved. The reluctance was evident, and he could measure their hesitance by how long it took till he heard the soft padding of their sandals following it as they moved out across the flat hills, carefully looking around. At least a full half mile of flat ground offered the most stunning views of the surrounding areas. The river sloped north around the hills, following the lazy pattern of the landscape between this and a much lower hill across the river. It disappeared somewhere between this lower hill and the inhabited one directly opposite. A lot of the landscape ahead was obscured by the rolling hills, the inhabited one having a slightly higher rise than the others, which gave it a better view of the surrounding countryside. Although this provided a much better defensive position, it was also virtually hidden in the other hills and almost impossible to see by accident unless you climbed the slopes. This confirmed Aeneas' suspicion that it wasn't an entirely friendly area since it warranted such fortifications. However, from this distance, the stone buildings scattered around the town looked cultured enough to offer some hope of an educated civilization here. Romulus commented silently in his own head that his point still stood. They must either find somewhere to shelter for the winter or risk a winter hiding from beach to beach, hoping to dodge between storms as his people slowly give up hope and strength, and the risk of starving increased daily. One risk increased another. A chance had to be taken, and it was theirs to take. Rough stone and gravel crunched underfoot as Romulus walked, creating an ominous hollow sound as he followed across the hilltop. More and more of the foothills opened up. The sheltered green of the lower section with pens of animals for the town, and sheep and goats and chickens patrolling the pastures. Even an occasional cow, still no human inhabitants were in sight. If the town had suffered an attack, then surely more of the houses would have been billowing smoke. No raiders would have left an entire stock of animals freely roaming the countryside, yet no children chased the chickens or sheep. No armor or spear points glinted above the palisade. No human movement was visible. Remus moved up beside him, with Aeneas only a step behind. Their hesitation was no longer apparent, but Romulus knew they were still holding back. As they neared the edge of the hilltop, figures became visible down in the valley below. Not just one or two, but what must have been the entire population of the town they were looking at. Centered in the crown was a huge stone altar, where slick, wet blood was visible even at the distance, flowing over the edges from the throat of a bull held by a priest covered from head to foot in white, blood-stained robes. The ceremony was very familiar to anyone from Rhodes or Minoa up through the Hellespont or across all of Greece, so much so that the three friends stood in awe and worship of the gods. That proved their undoing. Forgetting to drop to the ground to watch discreetly, they were still standing in worship of the gods when the trumpet broke the silence in the crowd below. Quick eyes flickered through the crowd. Romulus made out groups who were pointing towards them and shouting. Too late now to shrink back. He kept his back straight as a number of men mounted and broke off into groups of 10 or 12. Two of them moved as if they had been born on a horse, approaching the flanks of the hill on which they stood, too impatient to wait for the larger group of warriors behind. He could feel Remus and Aeneas fidgeting behind him, taking their aspas from their back and fitting to their arms, gripping their spears. Romulus did the same, looking west towards the river, watching the horses. He tried to judge their chances, if they stood and fought or made for the river. The river would be their only option if it came to running. The horses would just run them down if they tried to stay on land. Romulus had already made up his mind. Running and fighting both equaled suicide, with 30 experienced riders bearing down on their position, men who obviously know the surrounding terrain better than he. He had cast the dice, and now was the time to see what Tai Chi offered. No sudden moves, he said to his companions. So we're just going to let them kill us without a fight, cried Aeneas, as the first group of riders crested the hill in front of them. Fighting won't get us out of this, brother. Romulus threw him a withering look. We might take a few, but there are 30 horsemen. It's better to take a chance on peace. The horsemen did not come straight on, but circled the group in tight formation, their spears pointed towards them as they circled, as if they were penning on a bear. They slowed as the other groups crested the hills far behind. One man broke away and stopped outside the circle of horses as signals were passed between the groups. He was obviously the leader, judging by the barked orders, which brought the horsemen to a stop. All horses and spears pointing towards the three companions, with the gap left for the leader to approach. Bar, 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 called in the rough-clad leader in whatever barbarian tongue he spoke. Nobody moved a muscle, and Romulus could feel the tension rising, like a bowstring pulled back to the ear, ready to be released. Bar, bar, called the leader again, pointing his spear at the ground. Romulus hesitated only for a second. It was useless to do anything else. Standing erect, spears pointed towards the sky, arms open as he could make them to show that he meant no harm. He leant down, called on Remus and Aeneas to do the same. Lay down your spears. Are you mad, brother? Spat Remus. They'll skewer us. I will not go unarmed across the river Styx. The venom in his voice was not lost on the locals, who were braced for a fight and watching Remus as if he was a vicious dog. Romulus' head snapped back to face him as he set his spear and aspas on the ground. Do as I say. This is our only chance. In a voice calmer than he felt, he went on, "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already. Whatever is happening, this is our only chance at present." Seconds, which felt like hours, passed by as indecision and anger warred on Remus's face. Romulus found his eyes flickering to where he had laid his aspis, wondering if he could roll and come up with the two if Remus didn't see sense. One wrong move would see all three dead. The decision was made for him when Aeneas, quiet until now, laid his aspis and spear alongside Romulus. With a grunt of frustration, making the horseman twitch, Remus put his arms into the growing bundle on the ground. The atmosphere quickly changed when they had disarmed themselves. The leader of the horsemen barked another order. "Bar, bar, bar!" To the three's relief, the spears which had been pointing at them were raised, and a gap opened up on the village side of the circle. As he pointed with his spear, the three friends realized that their immediate danger was over and they were to be escorted down the hill to where the rest of the village waited by the altar. "I will fucking kill you if we're to be the next sacrifice, Romulus," grumbled Remus, still fuming, silently fuming. "Oh, shut your mouth, Remus," he snapped back. "We're still alive." 10 minutes later, as they approached the altar, flanked by riders, the crowd separated for them to approach, and even Romulus began to worry. They walked straight through to the center of the crowd, heads held high, until they reached the priest, his white robe splashed liberally with scarlet from his sacrifice. And that is the end of that chapter. I think now we're doing the questions and answers section. Hello. So, hello, Jenny. Dixon, how are you? Does anyone have any questions or? Hello, Kieran. The family is watching from home. Does anyone want to know anything? I suppose I should. So, yeah. So that scene is the arrival of Aeneas and some of the survivors of Troy to what what would become very obvious very quickly would be Rome. If you had the opportunity to, Jenny, if you had the opportunity to live anywhere in the world for a year while writing a book that took place in the same setting, where would you go? Greece or Rome? Well, I say Rome, Italy in general. Italy's always had sort of an appeal to me, very much since I was a child, and it was my first trip out of the country was to chef competitions in Sicily. So I've always had sort of an affinity for the country. And I've never had sort of a bad trip to Italy. Just sort of in Rome, everywhere you go, there just seems to be monuments and reminders of the past. This is much more awkward when you put nobody looking back at you to answer. This is like when you're in anywhere in Italy, but especially Rome and Greece too, for that matter. Like every corner you turn, you're tripping over some other monument from the past, and it just sort of inspires something. You can't help but try to imagine what was happening in those places in those times. Anybody else? Oh, I should actually mention as well that for QuaranCon, A Hero's Welcome has been dropped to 99 cents for the duration of the weekend over the con. It's very disorientating looking back at yourself. Anyone else got any questions? Kieran, will the Heroes of Troy become a trilogy or more? Or are you moving into new material? I would actually envisage it as probably more than a trilogy, maybe a quartet. But at the moment, I'm actually working on a fantasy book, which just sort of struck in my head while I was still trying to work out the next moves on the Heroes of Troy series. It's based much later, say 15th century, mid-Europe, and yeah, it just sort of came up. Jenny, Italy is such a beautiful country. One of my friends was born in Italy. You talked about monuments. That reminds me of the absolutely beautiful cover of A Hero's Welcome. How did you actually choose the cover artist? Cover artist is Sean T. King. Yes, he did an absolutely fabulous job of that. I got my cover. He works with quite a few of the self-published groups that I would actually know, and I think Bengali recommended him. I would be quite a fan of some of Bengali's covers and his work. He did a Grimdark trilogy where he released 3 books in the 1 year. And yeah, I don't think it was actually Sean did the covers, but I really liked them, and so I asked him for advice at the time. So yeah. So I'm just checking if there's any questions over anywhere else. So now bear in mind, I'm also a chef. You can ask me about that too. uh, what interests me most about it? I sort of just fell into being a chef, to be honest. Coming out of school, I was working weekends and evenings doing it. And I was accepted for it for college uh, long before the results came out for anything else. And yeah, just carried on with it, and then took a lot of years of working an awful lot of hours. And at the moment, I cook in a hospital, which gives me sort of more time when I started to write. And yeah, my favorite dish. Difficult question, but probably stroganoff. It's not particularly complicated, but I've just always really liked it, done well. Wine list, even. Yeah, that'd be extensive. Um, None. I don't want you to get a mess in the cupboard. uh, oh. Deep reds from the south of Italy. The next reading now is Jessa Forrest will be doing a reading now in 2 minutes. So I suppose we should call an end to this. Thank you for coming, and be sure to go in and see Jessa Forrest's reading now in 2 minutes. And thank you all for coming. It's been a lot of fun.